Okay, we move on to the next piece of business, which is the General Secretary's, it's for us to adopt the 2024 Annual Report, and I'll ask for the General Secretary to move.
President, Conference, Dave Penman, General Secretary, moving the Annual Report. Conference, why are civil servants so lazy? It's not a question I ask myself, to be honest, or indeed anyone else, but it was the question that adorned the entire front page of the Evening Standard only a few short weeks ago, and here it is in all its glory. It did, of course, refer to civil servants working from home. Minister's second favourite subject at the moment after staff equality networks. This was no random front page from a paper with skin in the game. After all, its very existence is dependent on commuters. This was the result of an opinion piece volunteered by the Minister for the Cabinet Office, John Glenn. Once again, a minister banging on about getting civil servants back to the office. All the usual watercolour moment anecdotes and no hard evidence as to why the answer for 500,000 civil servants doing thousands of different jobs in hundreds of different organisations is exactly the same, 60%. In The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a supercomputer called Deep Thought takes 7.5 million years to come up with the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. That answer, as the many geeks in this room who've already giggled will know, was 42. Well, at least there was some deep thought when it came to that answer. 60% is the answer for the entire civil service, because apparently that's what they do in the private sector. Top-down, evidence-free micromanagement of the civil service. It is, unfortunately, what we've come to expect, as has the baiting of the right-wing press to attack the civil service, trashing the brand. It didn't even matter that the statistics in the accompanying article showed that the vast majority of government departments were meeting the 60% target, because that would simply get in the way of showing a leg, as one minister put it to me, to the right of the party. So we end up with this front page. What message does it send to civil servants working on average an extra day a week of unpaid overtime? What message does it send to those that ministers say they want to attract to the service with the skills that we desperately need, but aren't prepared to pay for? And what are we to make of a government that has apparently decided that the demands of the civil service in 2029 will exactly match the number of civil servants that we employed in 2019? The Chancellor said he wants to cut the size of the civil service by 70,000 by the end of the next Parliament. Like Stalin announcing tractor production for the next 5 years, ministers have decided on a number for political purposes. No focus on outcomes, no recognition of what the civil service is expected to achieve at that point, no matching resources to commitments, and absolutely no logic. Can you imagine the chief executive of any private sector organisation of the size and complexity of the civil service saying to shareholders, before they'd even set out their plans for the next 5 years, I know exactly the number of staff I need in 2030. Top-down micromanagement, not focused on delivering a civil service fit for purpose for the challenges of the next decade, but merely a convenient tool for political point scoring. So when reality meets rhetoric, we have a government that has a whole range of commitments it says it wants to deliver, whilst also wanting to cap the civil service numbers this year and then reduce the service by 70,000 over the next 5 years. HMRC is the perfect example here. Government policy of freezing tax thresholds means there's 1.2 million extra higher rate taxpayers this year alone, and record numbers of self-assessment returns to process. The department is struggling to cope with the increased demand on its services like helplines, and along with the rest of the civil service, is facing huge budgetary pressures. As it tries to manage these pressures, it inevitably has to cut services, like those helplines. But when they announce that, ministers find it politically unpalatable and demand they stay open. When MPs cross-examined the Permanent Secretary, we end up with an inquisition on home working, even though HMRC has demonstrated previously there is no difference in productivity from home or office working. So rather than address the fundamentals of supply and demand in public services, we end up in a rabbit hole of ideology. Safer ground for some, but serious government it is not. And serious government is exactly what the civil service needs. Living hand to mouth without the ability to plan or a clear idea of what it's expected to deliver. And under a decade, we've had an entire football team of ministers for the Cabinet Office, who could, of course, have played the 11 Secretaries of State for Education that we've had in the same period. This is not just the consequence of the chaos under Johnson and Truss. This Prime Minister changed 3 Treasury Ministers, including the one with the responsibility for HMRC, in his reshuffle last November, only a year after appointing them. The football team analogy works well here. Speak to any football fan and they'll tell you about the successful era of their team under one manager. I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with John Lambie's glory days in the 90s with Partick Thistle. Or indeed that other Scottish manager, Alex Ferguson. Owners who are constantly switching managers end up with less success and, crucially, waste money as they're constantly changing plans and priorities. It's no different in government. Regardless of who wins the next election, we need a return to good government. Ministers say they want a smaller but better paid civil service. Well, ministers, I've got some news. It's entirely in your gift. Give the civil service the stability it craves, clear objectives and the right resources. Crucially, the freedom to manage them. Fair reward to recruit, retain and motivate committed public services. Then rightly hold the civil service to account for the outcomes that it's committed to. But no more micromanaging and no more trashing the brand. Speak to any civil servant and they know their duty is to serve the government of the day. Commentators often get it wrong when they say the civil service is independent. It's not. But it also has a legal and constitutional obligation to be impartial and to be able to serve future governments. That's why upholding the rule of law is so significant. It's not just a matter of professional ethics or some abstract concept. It's a legal obligation on civil servants, enshrined in the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010. Parliament decided that it wanted civil servants to uphold the rule of law and administration of justice. It means that neither ministers nor guidance can overrule this. Only Parliament can. And it means quite simply that if a minister asks a civil servant to break the law, they must refuse. And let's be clear, this includes international law. When the Civil Service Code was written in 1996, it included references to international law and treaty obligations. When it was revised in 2006, this wording was amended, but the government confirmed that this was simply about simplifying the language and neither the meaning nor the intent changed. The government is also perfectly entitled to instruct civil servants to ignore international law, but only if Parliament passes the necessary legislation. So when government found itself in a political bind of its own making, its way out was to fudge this issue and dump it onto the lap of civil servants. Faced with competing factions in the party, some committed to the European Court of Human Rights and some, shall we say, less so, they tried to have it both ways. It said ministers could ignore interim orders from the European Court, Rule 39 orders are they called, that might be issued to prevent removing an asylum seeker to Rwanda. Just like ignoring an injunction from a domestic court, that's breaking the law. But the government also said that it was honouring its commitments to international law. If you're a minister, you can apparently face both ways at once. But if you're a civil servant, you don't have that luxury. And what they know is a controversial and toxic policy already being hijacked by some to attack the civil service. They've left civil servants in this invidious position. They couldn't solve it politically, so they ducked it. And they did what no government should ever do: leave doubt as to whether there's a conflict between acting on instructions of ministers or observing the Civil Service Code. This is no accident, Conference. It's not poor drafting. It's deliberate. This could and should have been cleared up at any time. We've been asking the government since March to change the legislation or get Parliament to change the Civil Service Code, but they've refused, which is why it's both reckless and cowardly. Ministers may be happy to leave civil servants in this impossible position, but we are not. That's why we have launched our judicial review. When members at the Home Office ask us if they're being asked to break the Civil Service Code, they deserve an answer. They know they're tasked with some of the most difficult and sensitive work in government. You don't work in the Home Office and not realise that that's the day job, regardless of the political persuasion of government. But they rightly expect to know, without a shadow of a doubt, whether they're being asked to break the Civil Service Code. Ambiguity is not acceptable. And so our action is to bring clarity for those members. It is not, as is being painted by some ministers and the usual suspects in the press, a political act. Far from it. We have pleaded with government to avoid this. But avoiding this means being honest about what they're doing. And that, apparently, is a step too far. So we have no choice but to ask the courts for clarity. It is not a choice we welcome, but we will not walk away from our members in the Home Office. That's not who we are. For over a century, we have been defenders of both civil servants and the civil service. Pragmatic by instinct, because that's what delivers better results in the longer term. But as we have shown time and time again, if that pragmatism is not matched, we will take the action necessary to defend our members and the integrity of the civil service. That's why we continue to grow as a union, over 50% in the last 5 years. And as we approach this election, where we can add real value to the national debate, using the insight of our members, we want to help shape how a new government responds to some of the biggest challenges. We know whoever wins the election, they're going to face an enormous fiscal challenge. So last month, we published our blueprint for investing in the people, technology and skills necessary in HMRC to help bridge some of the tax gap. A report funding the nation has already been picked up by the Labour front bench and is part of their commitment to fund the NHS, with a commitment from Labour to invest £500 million in HMRC. And we're meeting with ministers later this month to urge the current government to adopt our ideas. Our CPS section is working on a report that looks at workloads for prosecutors and the impact it has on prosecution rates in rape and serious sexual offences, where the volume of evidence has multiplied over recent years. And later this afternoon, at our reception, you'll hear from Paul Whiteman, General Secretary of the Head Teachers Union, NAHT, on the joint work we are doing to bring Ofsted inspectors and head teachers together to work on the challenges faced by the education system and those tasked with leading it. Conference, the coming election may or may not bring about a change of government, but the challenges facing the civil service in many ways will be the same. Limited resources at a time of almost unprecedented need. Delivering high-quality public services effectively and efficiently will be what you're tasked with as civil servants. And as ever, the FDA will be by your side. A strong, pragmatic advocate, supporting you, defending you, and doing all we can to help deliver those public services and for them to succeed. Conference, I move.
Thanks, Dave.